Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today with you. As I was listening to the Bishop's very, very thoughtful remarks, I couldn't help but think, Bishop, that ISIS has clearly perceived this gluttonous appetite for sensationalism that you describe so accurately, and has designed its particularly vicious atrocities to quench that appetite that's out there in the world. And so this sort of reasoned and fair-minded and calming approach that you are calling us all to embrace is made all the more difficult by the cruelty of the bare facts that we face in the threats around us. I am very honored to be joining Your Grace, as well as IDC and the panel members, for today's discussion on the Middle East and minorities here at the National Press Club. I know I speak for many people when I say that your tremendous advocacy for tolerance and goodwill, human rights and religious freedom throughout the Middle East and indeed the world has earned the admiration of so many, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. At a time when the very future of Middle East minorities, including Coptic Orthodox Christians, the region's largest body of Christians, is imperiled, I am convinced that there is no better person than Your Grace to be drawing attention to this crisis and speaking his mind on its implications. I would like to address my remarks more broadly, if I may, to this issue of religious freedom and how it is sort of the antidote to the poison that seems to be infecting so much of that region of the world. And I look forward, perhaps during the back and forth after our presentations, to responding more specifically on the issues related to the media. Like everyone else in this room, I have watched with feelings of shock and revulsion, horror and outrage, as ISIL has terrorized two of the Middle East's most vulnerable minorities, Christians and Yazidis. I have seen the same reports that you have. Women and girls kidnapped and enslaved, men and boys beheaded or crucified, families driven from their homes and facing starvation and death, and 2,000-year-old communities of life and faith uprooted and threatened with extinction. And knowing the enormity of the suffering, I am convinced of two things. First, while I know our country, the United States, and like-minded states have been rendering assistance, we must do more. Lives are at stake, conscience calls and demands our utmost. But second, emergency help, while essential to protect lives and communities from the current danger, is not enough. In the long run, there is only one permanent guarantor of the safety, security, and survival of religious minorities. It is the full recognition of religious freedom as a sacred human right which every nation, government, and individual must fully support, and no nation, no government, and no individual must ever violate with impunity. Clearly, one of government's most important responsibilities is to recognize, protect, and nurture religious freedom. But as we know, most Middle East governments have repeatedly failed to do so, especially when faced with the rise of religious extremism. In Saudi Arabia, for example, extremist forces profoundly influence the government. The kingdom bans churches and any public religious expression that contradicts its own interpretation of Sunni Islam, while meting out barbaric punishments to transgressors, as we have seen with the brutal flogging of Raif Badawi and the cruel imprisonment of his lawyer, human rights defender, Walid Abu al-Khair. In Iran, extremist forces literally are the government. From Christians like Pastor Abedini to other religious minorities such as Baha'is and Sunni Muslims, and to dissident Shia, the regime subjects those who contradict its own brand of Shia Islam to arrests and torture, incarceration, and even death. In Egypt, the government continues to enforce anti-blasphemy codes, with Coptic Christians and other minorities, including atheists, bearing the brunt of the enforcement, while failing to protect minorities from violence or to bring the perpetrators to justice. And of course, there is the situation in Iraq and Syria, in which governments and non-state actors alike target religious minorities. In Iraq, the government fails to protect Christians and Yazidis, as well as Shia Muslims and dissenting Sunnis, with ISIL's depredations the latest in a series of extremist assaults against these communities. In response to this failure, many Iraqi Christians sought refuge in Syria. But President Bashar Assad treated Syrians as members of sectarian groups vying for his favor, rather than individual citizens possessing equal rights under the law. When massive numbers peacefully took to the streets and demanded their rights as citizens, Assad's regime fired on them while turning sectarian groups against one another. The civil war that followed has left Christians and others deeply vulnerable, with the regime's forces not only failing to protect them, but along with extremist groups on both sides actually attacking their communities. The story of both Iraq and Syria offers a cautionary tale to Christians and other religious minorities. In both countries, these minorities were safe for a while, but that was mostly due to the capricious whim of dictators, Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Assad in Syria, who chose to protect them for their own purposes. But to rely on the favor of a single strongman or regime is to live precariously indeed. For the better part of 20 centuries, the most persecuted religious minority in Europe was forced to live that way as well. Europe's Jews once faced the same predicament that Middle East Christians have faced in our time, relying on a strong man's good graces in country after country. The question, of course, is what happens when the strong man passes from the scene or loses control? Another question is what happens if he changes his mind one day and decides it's no longer in his interest to protect an embattled minority. In the blink of an eye, a minority's safety and security could vanish. Clearly, there has to be a better way to ensure protection for religious minorities. Thankfully, there is a better way. It is the way of religious freedom. Rulers come and rulers go, but when a society commits itself to religious freedom, it guarantees the security of religious communities no matter who holds power. Granted, to embed religious freedom and other human rights in a society is no easy task, but consider the alternatives. Simply stated, there are no alternatives. And so, when forces of violent religious extremism and other threats to minorities rear their head, the ultimate answer is not an Assad or a Saddam. It is never just one man. It is never just one administration. It is never a dictator who can change his mind and break his promises in a heartbeat. The ultimate answer lies with an idea, and that idea is religious freedom. For humanitarian reasons, for the sake of Christians and other Middle East minorities, we must stand tall for this freedom as an antidote to religious extremism. But there is another reason too. In standing for this bedrock liberty, we stand for our own security as well. From the 9/11 attacks on America to this January's assaults in France, it is clear that as with any other region, what goes on in the Middle East won't stay in the Middle East. Unless it is countered and defeated by religious freedom and pluralism, the poison of religious extremism will cross oceans and continents. When Christians in Egypt or beyond the Middle East, in Pakistan, are jailed for blasphemy or attacked by extremists for supposedly violating such laws, and we are silent, we should not be surprised when attacks commence in the streets of Paris or elsewhere. When Coptic Christians are beheaded by ISIL in North Africa, people risk succumbing to the same terrible fate elsewhere. Clearly, the Middle East's business, and indeed the world's business, is our business when it comes to the way religious minorities are treated. That is why we are here today. Let us be clear. The time for silence is over. The time to speak out is now. The time to bear witness is today. There is no other option, and there is no other way. We must heed the call of conscience and stand together for freedom. I would like to close my remarks with a story from many centuries ago that I think has some bearing on this notion of what it means to build societies that honor the rights of conscience. John Wycliffe, the English philosopher, theologian, reformer, and preacher, undertook to translate the Bible from the Latin Vulgate into the common vernacular in the late 1300s. And he did so in the face of enormous opposition and even persecution from the ecclesiastical authorities of his day. But despite all, he persisted. And when his work was done, he wrote the following words in the flyleaf of that first Bible. "The translation is complete and shall make possible government of the people, by the people, and for the people." Many of you might have thought that that famous phrase derived from a famous address at Gettysburg, but it has a much older patrimony. Now, we cannot know precisely what Wycliffe meant when he wrote those words, but I believe he was illuminating for all of us the profound insight that when men and women are free to pursue and understand truth for themselves, they become empowered to build societies that honor the claims of conscience and fundamental liberties and rights of all people. May it be our goal to build such societies. Thank you.